Hello and welcome to Session 2 in Cloud First Summit 2021, organised by Digit. I'm Mark Stephen. I'm going to be chairing this next 90-minute session. And effectively, this is going to be 3 breakout sessions across 3 parallel streams. You can move between the streams and attend the 3 options live, and the remaining breakouts will be available on demand post-event. Now, just to tell you the other 2 sessions that are available at the moment, Breakout B is 3 factors that will keep your cloud program on course. That's with John Gasparini from Bright Solid. Breakout C is what is hybrid cloud and why? Good question, with Sarah Lean from Microsoft. But this is Stream 1, Breakout A. And we've got Jonathan Forbes, CTO for Phlo, who's going to be looking at cloud analytics for healthcare. So Jonathan, over to you.
At Digit and to our sponsors for helping out with this today. My name is Jonathan Forbes. I'm the CTO at Phlo. Phlo's a digital pharmacy, and we're going to spend some time today looking at cloud analytics in healthcare as experienced in the pharmacy sector. So first of all, a little bit of background on pharmacy and Phlo in particular. Pharmacists are clinical experts in medicine and healthcare, and Phlo is an example of a digital pharmacy. A digital pharmacy has a particular operating model. It's not a place. It's not like a high street pharmacy where you can go and visit and speak to a pharmacist face to face. A digital pharmacy is what's called a distance selling pharmacy, and it operates entirely electronically, if you like, and our job is to get the medicine to you rather than for you to come and get the medicine. And we've taken that way of working and tried to fit it around how we think our patients want to manage their medication. So the kind of things that we do, we source medicines, we dispense medicines, we deliver them, prescription-only medicines rather than the sort of medicines that you can pick up in a supermarket or in a community pharmacy. So we have a pharmacy operations team that manages that. We market our services, and we design and engineer patient-facing applications and our own pharmacy operating system, all of those cloud-based as you would expect, and we study our data. What we don't do, just for the avoidance of doubt, we don't prescribe medicines. Medicines are prescribed by GPs and doctors. We work closely with GPs and doctors and with patients, obviously. And between those 3 sets, the goal here is to allow patients to quickly and easily manage their condition using medicine. And part of this is because medicine is intensely personal, is an intensely personal thing. And a famous Greek medic from many centuries ago said it's not so much about the illness the person has as the person the illness has. And that's a theme that we're going to explore a little bit here in terms of analytics as well. The other thing we don't do, by the way, is we don't set the charge for a prescription. In Scotland, there is no charge. In England, there is a charge. We do a lot of our business with NHS England, and there is a prescription charge there. That isn't set by the pharmacies, that's set by government. Another aspect to consider here is that, like, say, financial services, like so much actually of utility services in the UK, we're a regulated sector. And if I was to sum it up, I would say Phlo manages the unglamorous, uncool, but totally necessary last mile of the healthcare supply chain. That's what we're there to do. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the style of medicine and healthcare that we're involved in. It's something called P4 medicine. This is early stage stuff. This idea has been around for a while, but we're slowly getting to the point where it's starting to make sense. This idea of P4 medicine is personalized, participatory, preventive, and predictive medicine. And what it does, the advances that we've seen recently, we've seen them in the last year, even with COVID and the development of vaccines. Medical science and technology it has moved on leaps and bounds, and the advances that we see in genetics and biochemistry and neurophysiology and imaging and data processing, all of these things mean we've now got to the point where we've got diagnostic biomarkers in people's genomes that we can relate back to medical conditions. So the next natural step is to create the targeted therapies and the gene therapies that can then treat these conditions. P4 medicine puts the patient at the center of all of that. They get kept up to date continuously on their condition, and their quality of life becomes integrated into the treatment plan. It's not the accessory bolt-on that it perhaps has been. And of course, many of you sitting on the call here will have smartwatches. You'll have Pelotons, or you'll go to the gym and you'll bring a token to the gym and get data about your own personal health care. More and more people are now becoming aware and building an understanding of the factors that are influencing their healthcare and the decisions that they themselves are making. So there is some distance to travel on this yet. It all sounds very exciting. It is very exciting, but it is in effect what people think medicine is or should be. But we've got a ways to go yet. And just relating some of this stuff back to cloud, one of the things where we see significant advantage, you can pop onto Google anytime, type into Google Cloud Healthcare API, Google Cloud Life Sciences API. You will see off-the-shelf services that allow you to process medical information data exchange formats, even processing genome data. The Life Sciences API will allow you to do that. That's work that we would otherwise have had to do ourselves. Invest time, money, effort, and skill to build that. We don't need to. Cloud doesn't just give us compute and storage. It gives us access to services quickly on demand that we wouldn't otherwise be able to use. And they're almost like Lego building blocks. If you can assemble them in the right order, you can get a much more pervasive solution out of the back. So the basics of a lot of what businesses want to do are in the cloud, and they need pulled together and assemble to create your end state. I want to show you something here, just very quickly. A lot of you will have reverted, a lot of you wouldn't have had any choice, but you'll have reverted to online shopping in lockdown 1, for example. Online shopping in retail space, that's about 20% penetration of digitized services prior to pandemic. It must be, I don't know the exact figure, it must be double that or triple that now. Stubbornly sitting at 0.5% is the digitization of pharmacy services. Now that will have increased, it has increased, but it's increased from 0.5% to 1% or 2% or 3%. There's still a long journey to go there. So what we're trying to do in Phlo is we combine our cloud services in a way that makes it much easier for the patients to come on board and to enjoy the service, and do it with reassurance and do it with security and clinical safety around the outside. A lot of that increase in demand has obviously come because medicine itself, particularly how we as patients experience it presently, where we may not be at the GP face-to-face with a doctor there, and may not have been there for a long time, and may be facing some significant delays in getting back to that state, simply because of demand. So a lot of the consultation process on healthcare has moved online, and it moved really quickly online, and we should be thankful that it was able to do that. It's not ideal for everybody. Absolutely not ideal for everybody, but in many cases it allows people at least to speak with an expert in their illness. What Phlo does on the other side of that is, it's all very well that you then maybe have a consultation and get a prescription through your GP, but if you then have to get out of your sick bed and go to the pharmacy and pick it up, that kind of, it doesn't square. So what we've tried to do is pull that whole thing online so that the medicines get delivered to you as safely and as efficiently as possible. So we do it using a series of applications. We have our patient-facing applications. You can see a couple of them here. You can see the kind of data that they hold. There's data there on prescription items, medicines themselves, on delivery times, on upcoming requests. There's then data that's streaming back to us from our logistics partners about where medicines are in the end-to-end process. And we pull all of that data together in the cloud. And this telemetry fuels a lot of the insights and the actions that we can subsequently take. So To give you a flavor in our world compared to Amazon Prime has cropped up a couple of times today in conversations. They sort of set the difference between an e-commerce retail environment and a healthcare online digitized environment. On the left are some examples of the data sets that we work with: GP lists and medicine lists and logistics from our partners on where things are in the supply chain, wholesaler data, prescription data itself. On the right are the kind of interactions that we and the kind of processes that we have to go through with our systems in healthcare. So interactions are clinically risk assessed. They're expert assessments made of prescriptions as they're being checked as part of the dispensing process. We don't control the price of medicines in the UK. It's largely done, the suppliers don't control it. The NHS publishes something called the Nhs Drug Tariff, which basically says this is what we will pay a pharmacy for the medicines that have been dispensed. That comes out every month and it changes. We'll see some of that data later on. Remember, again, stressing we're a regulated sector. And our patient interactions are long-term positive relationships to help people manage their conditions. So sometimes we operate like the healthcare provider and experts that we are. Sometimes we behave like Amazon and Deliveroo in getting medicines to the right people in the space of a couple of hours in many cases. And sometimes, because we're regulated, we have to operate like your bank. So we've got all these different pressures on us that we need to solve, and we solve those using cloud systems. I'm going to give you a view of the data side of our business and our modern cloud platform, which is here. This is a conceptual view. Maybe the first thing to note here is that we have two cloud systems. You heard it mentioned earlier in Vicky's talk about this idea of hybrid. Hybrid extends to the number of clouds that you might actually be using at any one time. We do our operations and a big chunk of our analytics in the Google Cloud platform, but we control all of that from the Azure cloud platform. We use Azure DevOps. And to be honest, I'd like to say that there was some compelling reason as to why that was done that way. There isn't really. We just find it easier to work with the Azure DevOps environment. So that controls what happens in our Google Cloud platform environment. I think in the actual analytics environment itself, as we see it on the left-hand side here, you can sort of see the operational systems, and traditionally they flow from left to right. What we have that's interesting and what we're trying to achieve that's interesting is a distribution layer that then pushes insights that we generated from our data, pushes the actions and decisions back onto the operational systems. So we layer our architecture like this, and then we line it up with the solutions that we get off the shelf from the cloud, and then we knit those together. So I'm going to show you some of our considerations here. There's a lot of writing on this slide. Don't worry about it. The sort of big boxes at the top are the things that cover it. We've got our design considerations, our build and operationalization considerations. Then we have to factor in our analysis and modeling considerations, and of course, maintaining the quality of the data that we have in the system and the processes that we ourselves are using, the quality of our models and the quality of their outcomes, for example. Now, remember, we're a business now. We've tripled in size in the last 18 months. We're now just shy of 50 people in Phlo. 4 different product streams on the go at any one time, lots of change happening in the business as we scale up, as we put new pharmacies into new cities and all of that. So we have a very agile process. You heard it mentioned earlier on. We use what's called a team of team approach, which I'll talk about in a minute. And one of the things that we want to do with our analytics environment is set it up in a way that means it can keep pace with what's happening in our operational environment. That's difficult. I personally, I've no belief that our core operating data models will stay the same from one week to the next. So our analytics environment, which is pulling data from those rapidly changing data models, needs to have a similar approach. It needs to be able to flex. It needs to be able to adapt and build. And we want to automate as much of that as we can. We'll show you how we're getting on in a second. it basically means for a lot of what we do on the analytics side of our business, we are stealing with glee some of the DevOps tools and tricks that are used on the operational side of our business, and we're wrapping that up into something called DevOps, or at least I think that's what it's called today. I'm personally waiting for the it's either the zenith or the nadir, where we have operational ops or ops. At that point, we'll have eaten ourselves, I think. Right, here's how we're getting on in our data platform at the minute. Simple enough diagram. The green stuff is actually going quite well at the minute. The orange stuff needs a little bit of work. The stuff in grey, we need to progress, or we're in a position to progress more effectively now. We've still got some decisions to make. To give you an example, in our storage layer, we've got a well-formed, I would say, data lake. And processes surrounding it, but our ingestion processes need some work. We're capable of doing some stuff quite quickly and easily. There's a little bit more complication coming, so we need to treat that. And in our storage layer, we have our data warehouse, our version 1 of our data warehouse, and we probably need to go away and start that again. But the whole point of this stuff and the flexibility we get from the cloud is that we can go away and do that. We can take the lessons that we learned the first time around, modify the code, because that's all this is. This is infrastructure as code. And we can then build those lessons in. So cloud has allowed us to make great strides across many areas of our pure analytics infrastructure. And allowed us to test and learn and do experiments and fail at some of them and succeed at others, and then build those processes in. So we wouldn't get that flexibility with the traditional model. So I'll give you some observations, then we'll look at some of our data. I would say our observations, these 5 things, from my perspective as a CTO, there's just been an all-round reduction in fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We're not doing extensive capacity planning up front before making a large-scale capital purchase of an off-the-shelf piece of hardware to do a certain job. Because our infrastructure is basically defined as lumps of code rather than a physical piece of kit somewhere, we just change the parameters on our configurations. We find it to be extremely cost effective. To give you a really bad metric, it's the equivalent of Nadeem Sarwar, the CEO at Phlo, buying everybody in the company a coffee Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. That's what it's costing us to run our operational systems, 4, 5 different environments and our analytical environments as well. It's extremely cost effective, as was noted by one of the speakers earlier. Kylie mentioned that a lot of this is OPEX spend now rather than CAPEX. It makes it easier in many respects, although I do appreciate that larger organizations aren't necessarily set up to exploit OPEX. We mix cloud capabilities, so we have one cloud doing one thing, we have another cloud doing another thing, and they're joined together. We find it very easy to experiment, and we find it quite difficult in the first instances to integrate insights, and the reason for that is that positive feedback loop in the data platform needs to have a termination point in the operational systems, and the operational systems sometimes aren't built to be expecting something else to tell them what to do next. So you have to create those hooks in the operational system. We're not doing it yet, but we know what we need to do to make that work. And it will rely heavily on the kind of insights that we can generate from our data. And it disrupts IT. Everything is code. Chris Patton mentioned earlier how the rules have changed in IT as a result of this, and I agree. It can accelerate shadow IT, and it does give us in our case, we use a team of teams approach where we put all the right skills into a group. Very quickly, because I want to get on to some questions. This is an example of the kind of insights that we can flush out from our data. This is normalized data, so it's hiding a multitude of sins in many respects, but we're seeing a big increase in demand for medicines over the last year for an antidepressant. In particular, I'm looking at a specific antidepressant here called sertraline. We're seeing a big increase in it. We're only halfway through the year, and we're already seeing an uptick on that, in particular in the younger age groups. And in the age groups of 46 to 55, we are seeing that. So mental health is an issue. Mental health, even when you measure it in terms of the medicines that are typically prescribed to help people manage it, we are seeing an uptick. So cut people some slack. They're dealing with things. Just as a whole, across data, this is called price concession data. Price concessions is where the NHS price for a drug, the price they're willing to pay or reimburse for a drug, doesn't match what the market says the price of the drug should be. And you can see already there on the right-hand side, and this is data from last year, significant 2 or 3 times increase in the cost of medicines. There's another peak in there around 2018, end of 2018, start of 2019. That was a supply side peak, whereas of course on the right-hand side we have a demand side peak. Okay, so my closing question to you all, I suppose, is we've gathered all this data in our data warehouse and in our data lakes, and we've processed it and we've analyzed it. Is it worth anything? Is it worth anything in terms of what we can generate in forecasting mode or modeling mode from it? Because, of course, we've suffered 3 major setbacks, 3 major shocks to the system in the last 18 months. We've had a global public healthcare crisis. We've had immense interventions in the markets. We've got a new scale of remote working and in many ways a new way of working. So the data that we've generated over the last 18 months, is it still valid to include it in our modeling? Because it's not the business as usual stuff that we have been basing models on up until that point. So I'm going to ask you, if anybody out there knows this stuff better than we do, the data science aspect of things, I'd be interested in your thoughts. I'll close at that point, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. It's interesting because it's an area of which I know absolutely nothing. So this question has come in from Ewan Robertson because there was a lot of information contained within your presentation. And you said at one stage that the costs are very reasonable nowadays. It's the equivalent of your boss buying a coffee for everyone in the organisations Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. And he wants to know, is it a fancy coffee?
It's a fancy coffee.
It is a fancy coffee?
It's not one of the ones that Ewan might buy. It's an expensive one.
Sometimes I think we get the delegates we deserve. Listen, on a more serious point, when you said that your company has effectively tripled in size over the last 12, 15 months, would that scale have been achievable without cloud?
It's a good question. I think yes. Well, put it this way: we had to triple in size. The demand was such. But what it did, that point I made about removing fear, uncertainty, and doubt, we didn't have any of the traditional fears as technologists that, can the system cope? We had to make some changes to the system to allow us to move things around more effectively between our different branches. But we didn't have the fear that often the companies a desire to grow the business quickly. Yes, we had to increase our expenditure on certain components because we could see cloud monitoring gives us the ability to see what's happening under the covers. We could see that we were starting to hit some demand limits, but that exercise was it was a trivial thing for us to do when we put our heads together and decided that we needed to grow that capacity. So it allows us to, as technologists in a business, turn to the business teams and say, if you want to bring more pharmacies to the table, bring more pharmacists on board, bring more delivery partners on board, we can cope with that. You won't need to worry about the infrastructure.
How big a problem was it? Because obviously you're dealing across the UK and it's different health services. How big a problem was it in actually processing the different regulations in terms of privacy? We operate at the minute solely with NHS England. So we have a contract with NHS England to supply medicines to patients, and patients in England, in the NHS England system, have a right to have their prescription dispensed by any pharmacy, and every pharmacy is obliged to respond to a prescription request. So the regulations themselves for us, we work quite closely with people who know information security. Mentioned earlier on the red team, blue team model of information security and ethical hackers. We bring those people into our business on a regular basis to
to look for the flaws in the in our architecture, in our systems, and identify areas that we might need to patch before we put anything live. On the privacy side of things, we are an entirely consent-driven organization. So if a patient says, "Thanks very much for the prescription, I now want to put I want to nominate a different pharmacy," then we take them off our systems and they go to another system. Their data is removed. It's erased. We can't recover it at that point. So we take all of that. It's healthcare data at the end of the day. It's the most sensitive stuff that you can deal with. We take it all extremely seriously.
If there's that level of flexibility and potentially uncertainty, how do you tailor your storage requirements day to day?
Prior to cloud systems, that would have been a problem we would have worried about because everything has its capacity limit. When you put stuff into data centers, for example, you put it in with a specification, and that specification has a size, and then your rate of growth governs at which point you might add more components. We do none of that worrying at the minute. We have a data lake infrastructure for our analytics that is effectively infinite. It's not infinite, but from our perspective, it effectively is. And we pour our data in there as the starting point in its journey through to the models and the analysis that we do on it subsequently, which are really operationally focused at the minute. The data there is really about how we can make the delivery process, the supply process, the request process, how we can make all of those much more efficient.
Questions come in from Jerry Connican from Millersoft saying, what constraints have you faced, if any, in processing increasingly large volumes of data in real time? For example, operational alerting, and what tools are you using?
So we've no issues with the operational alerting and logging and auditing side of things. That's not a major issue for us. That's just taken care of in the background by the systems that we use. We use a system called Stackdriver, for example, but we also have links out to services that do what's called application performance monitoring that tell us where somebody using our applications, and they can be anywhere, in the country on a mobile phone. They're a patient at the end of the day. If they're having an issue, it'll show up in our monitoring stack. We've designed our architecture to allow us to cope. We're putting building blocks in right now for volumes of data that we're not even scratching the surface with at the minute. I'm thinking primarily of genomic data, because pharmacogenomics, which is the sort of marriage of genetic data and medicines in biochemical form and how they interact with the genome. We're laying that out now, in the expectation that within the decade, by 2030, we'll be in the level of genomic analysis that's going on in healthcare at the minute will have made its way almost in a commoditized form all the way through to the architecture that we're dealing with here. So your genome's different from my genome. Drugs react differently. Medicines react differently in your body than they do in mine. And therefore, can we tailor the medicines and the treatments to suit? But we're not there yet. If you talk to my pharmacy colleagues, they'll say, look, Jonathan, it's at least a decade. It might even be 2. But we don't want to find ourselves trapped in a corner in 10 years' time because we've gone down a certain route. So we're expecting it to happen, and it's a question of when rather than if.
Yeah. It's interesting. It raises lots of interesting questions at the same time. So, Jonathan Forbes, CTO at Phlo, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Right, we're going to move on now. Again, we've got another 2 streams running at the moment. Breakout E is Hybrid Cloud Will Save You. That's with Andy Hardy from Nasuni. And Breakout F is What is a Cloud First Strategy? And that's with Terry Story from Accutech. However, this is stream 1, so we're into Breakout D at the moment, and our next speaker is Laura Irvine, who's partner and head of regulatory law at Davidson, Chalmers, Stewart, looking at some of the key legal and data protection issues associated with cloud-based services. So, Laura, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I, as a lawyer, will obviously be talking about the legal regime in relation to cloud service providers. I wanted, first of all, to reflect on the last speaker's presentation and to put my presentation, I suppose, in context. Jonathan was talking about health data stored in the cloud, and a lot of the issues, concerns that individuals might have about that relate back to that trust and reassurance that we all want as individuals, that our data is being handled securely and that our data is being handled by organisations that we can trust to look after it properly. And that's really why the law about data protection and privacy exists. And so that puts what I'm about to say into context. It's not a law that's put in place to make sure that there's lots of hurdles to jump over for organisations, but it's really there to ensure that we as individuals trust organisations to look after our data. And particularly, I would say, in a digital sense, the last 18 months has allowed lots of organisations to move online and to operate digitally, and pharmacies ought to be doing that as well, and that was great to hear Jonathan talking about that. But as individuals, we also need to have that trust, and that's why the law is essentially there. I also just wanted to reflect on the first GDPR fine to be issued, which was in relation to a pharmacy. However, it wasn't a digital one. It was a pharmacy company based in London who left the medical records of their customers in the backyard of their shop. So nothing to do with digital online services, but a good old data breach where paperwork was left in an insecure place. So I think that puts in context as well how being online and being digital doesn't mean that we don't have to trust those organisations. There will be just the same trust issues when we are dealing with paper data as well. So I'm a specialist in data protection law. I'm very passionate about the issues that the law deals with, and particularly about privacy. The slides that I've got today will really cover three particular topics. It will be very much an overview. I have 20 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. I could talk about this stuff all day, but there are a few particular topics that I thought I should focus on, and these are all really dealing with data protection law. So it's about personal data stored in the cloud, and what's the legal position that organisations who are using cloud services need to think about, but also what should these cloud service providers also be putting in place and be thinking about. And again, that's all about trust. So I'll talk about the legal position for cloud service providers, and in particular the way that they're classed under the GDPR as a processor generally, and the difference that exists between processors and controllers, and what has to be put in place to make sure that trust is there. I'll talk about one of the biggest issues, I suppose, under the GDPR for cloud service providers is security, and just really a brief overview of what the law actually says there, but more what it means in practice. And then finally, I wanted to talk about international transfers of data post-Brexit and the impact of those on cloud service providers. I've written there in that first slide, adequacy or not, because when I drafted these slides, the UK did not have an adequacy decision. And it was, I think about an hour after I sent the slides to Digit, that it was announced that the UK was found to be adequate. So for those who don't know what that means, I will cover that later on in this presentation. But it has made things easier, certainly at the moment, for UK organisations dealing with cloud service providers, a good example, who maybe aren't based in the UK. So at least for the time being, that will be a little bit more straightforward. But there are also particular issues I want to discuss today about transfers to the United States, which became a lot more complicated last year due to a court decision. And then just the kind of summing up of this presentation will be why it's important to know the location of your server, and I've touched on that already. So let's talk about cloud service providers in terms of data protection law. I will talk about data protection law. That will cover the GDPR and also in the UK, the Data Protection Act. Now, the GDPR on the 31st of December last year in this country became the UK GDPR. So it transitioned into UK law, but it's pretty much exactly the same for the time being as the EU GDPR. So I will use the term GDPR interchangeably at the moment. There are a couple of slides which will touch on the differences now that we have, the transition period's ended and we have finally left the EU, but currently there's very little substantive change in terms of what the law says. That may change, and if I was here next year talking about this issue, it could be a very different conversation. So cloud service providers under the GDPR would generally be classed as processors of personal data. They would only process the data on behalf of a controller, of their customer. They only act on the instructions of that controller, and they cannot use that personal data for their own purposes. And this gives us the first stage of that protection. So essentially, cloud service providers, they're storing our data securely, and they will have clever ways of doing that, but they don't do anything on their own behalf. It's a very simple processing activity. Now, one of the changes when the GDPR came in was that they can now be fined. A processor can, under the old data protection law, was not capable of being fined by the regulator, but that has changed. And so the burden, I suppose, on processors is greater in terms of regulation. But one of the big issues is in terms of the contractual relationship that they would have with any of their customers who would be the data controllers. So processors have to have a contract, and that contract has to be in writing. They have to keep a record of their processing activities. Big burden. They must keep the data secure, and sometimes they'll have to have someone nominated as the data protection officer, which would be a statutory appointment, and that would be in particular if they are processing lots of health data, Jonathan. And then finally, they also have the obligation to cooperate with the ICO if they're carrying out investigations, etc. The controller, by way of contrast, has obligations which are similar to the processor in relation to carrying out, first of all, due diligence in relation to that processor. They have to make sure that they are comfortable with that organisation looking after their data, and obviously they also have to have a written contract in place, and that obligation legally lies with both the controller and the processor. This has to be a written contract, and it has to set out the instructions in terms of what that processor does with the data, so the controller remains in control. This written contract, has to set out quite a few legal requirements. There must be written instructions about what the processor can do. Anyone employed by the processor must be under a duty of confidentiality. There's obligations to assist the controller in relation to subject access requests and also breach notifications. At the end of the contract, that data must be deleted or returned to the controller. And also there must be the ability for your controller to carry out audits on your organisation. That can be a tricky one to put into practice. There's also obligations on processors if they are using any sub-processors. So if your processor could be a software provider, and that software provider will be subcontracting the storage of their data, a back-end database will be stored probably on a cloud service provider's server, and therefore they are a sub-processor. So the processor must have the same contractual arrangement with any sub-processor in essentially the same form as the contract with the controller. Processors built into the contract, processors can either be given the right to appoint new sub-processors without specific approval from the controller, but the controller must always be given the right to object. So essentially the controller needs to know where their data is, even if it's in a very long chain of sub-processors. Within that contract, there can also be the right for the sub-processor to be approved in advance by any controller. And that obligation will just depend on the sensitivity and the risks involved in that data processing. One of the very recent developments within the EU is that the Commission published a set of standard terms for the contract to be put in place between the controller and the processor. So this is something that hasn't existed before, and they were finally adopted just earlier this month, and they exist. Now that is one of the differences, I suppose, in terms of the UK and the EU. These contracts will apply in the EU. They don't have to be used. Other contracts are available. They have not yet been approved by the UK regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office. It's possible that they will. It is possible that the Information Commissioner will come up with their own set of contracts in terms of controller-processor arrangements. But they're a useful template, and I've certainly started using them and adapting them for my clients. I said I would touch just briefly on data security. So big obligation under the GDPR, and it became a lot more detailed and a lot more complex when the new data protection regime came in 2018. So both the controller and the processor have an obligation to keep personal data secure, and both can be fined if they fail in that obligation. There's a bit more detail in the GDPR than there was previously, and there's a whole list there of suggested measures that organisations can take. Now, none of these are written in stone. There is nowhere in the GDPR that says you must encrypt personal data, you must pseudonymise personal data. It's not written in stone, and it's all about making that assessment in terms of the risks involved in the processing that you are carrying out as an organisation. So let's go back to Jonathan. He would be expected to take very significant steps to keep that data secure, because it's health data, it's what we call special category data, and we as individuals expect that to be looked after very carefully for a very good reason. So these obligations are there, and it can be a difficult thing, I suppose, to advise on as a lawyer. As technology advances, security measures will be more sophisticated, but it's making that assessment and being accountable for that assessment as well. And that's the obligation that's set out in data protection law, UK GDPR, just the same as the one in the EU. No changes there yet. The next topic that I wanted to touch upon, and this is the issue that Brexit has impacted on most significantly, is about international transfers. So the UK is out of the EU and now is what under the EU GDPR would be classed as a third country. And the whole point of restricting these international transfers under the GDPR is to make sure that organisations can't just shift the data outside of the jurisdiction and then not have to comply with the strict data protection regime that is in place. So these transfers outside the EU are restricted, and essentially what the GDPR says is that if you are making a transfer, you have to ensure that essentially the same protections are in place in the organisation that you are transferring your personal data to, whether they're a processor or another controller. And that would include transfers to a cloud server that is outside of the EU. So that is what's classed as a transfer under the GDPR. They are storing your data, and if they're outside the EU, then that would be classed as an international transfer. Now, in terms of the UK GDPR, anything outside the UK is classed as an international transfer, and therefore there has to be consideration given to what additional protections have to be put in place. I mentioned at the beginning about the UK getting an adequacy decision, and that is now in place, and that certainly makes things easier in terms of transfers within the EU and the UK. So that's one of the transfer mechanisms that is set out in the GDPR. If the Commission, if you're under the EU regime, or if the Secretary of State in the United Kingdom's government has decided that the country provides essentially the equivalent protections, then it obtains an adequacy decision. And that means that data can be transferred without any additional measures being put in place. So that's where we are with the UK. And you would think it would be quite sensible given that we did implement the GDPR. The other two essentially methods of carrying out international transfers, one involves contractual mechanisms, and the third one is derogations, which can only be used in particular circumstances. I will talk about the second, contractual mechanisms, in a bit more detail because that's the one that's become controversial because of a particular decision. They are, just for reference, as a list of the countries now that have adequacy. So the UK adopted the same countries when we at the end of the transition period. South Korea may become adequate, is likely to become adequate. And of course, the United Kingdom now can be added to that list, which I didn't know at the time I drafted these slides. So here was my slightly confused little picture in terms of UK adequacy. So we have got adequacy. The EU has decided that we have essentially equivalent protections in place. The concern, I think, is whether that will last. Many of you will have noticed that the UK government decided it's going to create its own data protection regime, and it announced that the day before we had got this adequacy decision, which was particularly ill-timed. There's also concerns about bulk surveillance in terms of communication data, and concerns about onward transfers, particularly to the US, and I will explain why that's a concern. So last summer, a decision was made by the European Court of Justice about transfers to the United States. So previously there was a partial adequacy decision called Privacy Shield, and that allowed transfers to be made to organisations that had signed up to Privacy Shield. That was struck down as not providing enough protection, and that's essentially because in the United States, in particular, digital data can be accessed by state authorities, and also because there's a lack of redress in terms of data breaches for non-US citizens, who are EU citizens, weren't able to claim compensation or address any breaches in the United States. Privacy Shield, when adequacy decision disappeared, and also the court said, well, actually, if you're using contractual terms, we don't think they're enough anymore, and we're going to ask anyone that's transferring data internationally, so not just to the US, but anywhere, to carry out additional checks and take additional measures. What that's meant in the United Kingdom, now that we have left the EU, is that that adequacy decision didn't exist at the end of transition, therefore we couldn't adopt it. It doesn't exist, so we at the moment cannot transfer data to the United States without additional measures being taken. We in the EU, they have actually yesterday approved guidance on the additional measures that could be taken. They have also in the EU adopted standard contractual clauses, so that's one of the contractual mechanisms. But we don't have that yet in the UK. The Information Commissioner is drafting these and we expect them to be published shortly. So transfers to the United States in terms of data are difficult. And of course, there will be many, many cloud service providers based there. There's lots of software which is problematic at the moment. MailChimp is one of those, and similar types of software that many, many organisations use, store data in the United States. Privacy Shield is gone, standard contractual clauses are no longer adequate on their own. Now, there is guidance there and there are ways to make it safe, but it is not straightforward. So that's just a wee summary. If you're within the UK, processor, controller, contractual terms have to be put in place with your cloud service provider, but it's pretty straightforward to use those and to put in place these additional security measures, additional trust measures that the data protection law provides for. And now EU, EEA servers, they're all fine as well. You will need those contractual terms, and because we have adequacy, that's fine. Problems with continuing adequacy, I have certain clients who have put in place standard contractual clauses as well, just to belt and braces approach, just in case there are problems with adequacy going forward. Internationally, it's much more difficult. Risk assessments are required in terms of that country's data protection regime, and then the standard contractual clauses, which now exist within the EU, aren't quite in place yet in the UK, and so again, not straightforward to make these transfers compliant in the short term, but these things will unravel and will become hopefully a bit more straightforward going forward. So that was all that I wanted to say to you today, and happy to take any questions that you've got.
Laura, thank you very much for that. You mentioned the fact that companies are carrying out internal assessments at the moment. What's the feedback on that? Are these internal assessments being carried out adequately?
It's a really, really difficult process. So the assessment in terms of that's required in terms of international transfers is to assess the other country. So I've done it from a UK, well, actually from a Scottish point of view. I had to carry out an assessment of our laws, and that would include not only data protection laws, but human rights laws. It would also include the state powers of surveillance. So I had to provide quite a lot of detail about what powers the police have in terms of obtaining warrants to get personal data, and then the kind of covert surveillance that's allowed as well. So these assessments are complicated, and then if there are issues in that country, you then have to put in additional measures. And that's the information or the guidance that we are lacking, and particularly in the UK. There is something now in the EU. We've had nothing to see whether that's been adopted yet. But you do just have to, I think, as organisations, really document everything that you're doing. Please don't ignore the issue, but just try and prepare for that time when we will have proper guidance in terms of what we need to be putting in place.
To a certain extent, you've preempted my next question, which was, given the sheer rate of legislative change, are some companies being tempted just to say, look, forget it, we'll have a look at it once the dust has settled?
Yeah, Mark, that is a really kind of normal, I think, way of approaching this, and particularly, the start of this year, there's been so many issues, but when the transition period ended, it was very uncertain for many areas of law, but as a data protection practitioner, we had a period of 6 months to sort this out, but of course nothing got sorted out until last week when we got this adequacy decision. And companies had spent the previous 2 years not knowing what was happening as well. The no deal, Brexit, and all of these issues meant that, yes, some organisations in certain sectors actually had been told you must put these in place, high-risk sectors, as you would expect. But for other organisations where perhaps this isn't such a high risk, data processing isn't such a high risk, then I have a few clients who've said that we're just going to hold off, we're going to wait, we're going to document this, we know what we we're likely to need to do, and we'll be ready to do it when we have that clarity. But we haven't got it yet. And I suspect the regulator is very, very conscious of these difficulties. You know, businesses are facing so many issues at the moment. Is data protection high on the priority list? Of course, I would like it to be, and it should be for some organisations, but it's very understandable that it isn't for others.
Does that not put you professionally in quite a difficult set of circumstances? Because people are coming to you for advice and you can't give it to them.
Yeah, it is. It's a really difficult message to say, here's a contract. So for the past 6 months, we've been working on an old version of the standard contractual clauses. Here's a contract. You need to put this in place. You need to pay me to put that in place, please. But see, in 6 months' time, I reckon you'll need a different version of this, and it will be more complicated. And you're going to have to come back to me to help with that. So great for business as a lawyer, but a terrible, professional ethical dilemma to have to say that to companies, which is why in certain circumstances, and it is in certain circumstances, I think a pragmatic approach is the right approach to make. But you need to be seen to be doing something, because it is an issue, and it's an issue because of that trust, and an issue because we as organisations need to have that trust from the individuals whose data we are looking after.
Ewan Robertson from Insights come back with another question saying, given countries such as Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Lithuania have in effect a national ID which could be used for a range of cloud-based services, is there any legal reason in the UK why we can't make that happen?
There's no legal reason. These issues will be bound up in our identity as UK citizens, where we've never had that national identity. But there are conversations going on, both at UK government level and Scottish government level. So I was involved in a webinar quite recently where the Scottish government were talking about proving your identity. So it's not. It was very much posited in a positive way, and that kind of improving that contact you have, particularly with public sector organisations, where you can be still in control of your identity. And I think blockchain might have been involved, and telling organisations who you are, particularly in the health sector, but making sure that it's not being used in that very negative Orwellian way that we're all scared of as a country. And so there are cultural issues, I think, in the UK as well, but not legal. There's no legal barrier to doing it.
There are companies coming to you, obviously understand the realities of the situation and how potentially damaging it can be if they get it wrong. Do you get the sense that UK politicians are actually on top of this? Do they understand it?
So
here comes the diplomatic answer.
Trying. This document that was published at the weekend, which is amusingly called the Tigger. The Tigger. I can't remember what it stands for. All I can think of is Winnie the Pooh, obviously.
They're wonderful things.
Indeed, something like that. That set out someone's understanding of the existing regime and how it needed to change, and very ably demonstrated a lack of understanding of what's already in place and what needs to be put in place, full of conflicts. There will be, of course, there are people in government who understand this, but there's an awful lot of push towards opening up. As we have left the EU, let's take advantage of this opening up. But I would worry and be concerned that will cause people to be much more concerned about using online services in particular, because they don't trust them and because they don't trust the government's understanding of the regimes that are already there for a good reason. And it's going to be difficult to maintain that trust going forward. And I think we're at a tipping point. I do think we're at a fundamental stage where companies like Jonathan's will give us a benefit as human beings, but will human beings trust anything online because of the concerns that are raised by not just governments, big tech companies, and that kind of that interplay, I think, is really difficult to disentangle, and the government needs to do it very carefully. That's my concern.
Laura, thank you very much for that. Thank you for the presentation, and thanks for answering those questions too. Right, this third breakout is actually the only live stream which will now be running. And it's going to be delivered by Mark Mitchell, who's the Security Engineering Manager at Checkpoint. And this is becoming something, we're only talking about 5 years or so of history of this, but a constant tension between compliance and the desire for people, that it just happens instantaneously. So compliance in the age of convenience. Mark.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Mitchell. I'm Security Engineering Manager for Scotland and the North for Checkpoint in the UK. This morning we're going to talk about compliance in the age of convenience. We're going to discuss a number of thematics around cloud security, best practice for compliance both on-prem and off-prem. There's been sessions around hybrid data center, etc. And concurrently with this one, best practices for threat hunting. And in some respects, what not to do and what to do. A kind of approach to the process behind delivering compliance within multiple environments. As a background, Checkpoint have been a significant digital player for a number of years. We have developed from Firewall 1, we developed the first stateful inspection firewall, through to where we are today with over 100,000 customers worldwide in a multi-sectoral environment and with now nearly 6,000 employees. Checkpoint supplies security for a number of different areas, and today we will focus in on effectively compliance in cloud and network, so physical appliances in an on-prem environment and a data center, through to basically compliance in the public cloud environment for virtualized instances, servers, databases, for example. But also we'll draw in threat hunting at the end. How do you consolidate and bring these things together? But to start, I think one of the areas that we do need to consider is effectively, where are we? And the area in which I have drawn from is the science fiction in the 1970s. And this quote hit me during the Christmas period. I was given a copy of Rollerball and DVD. We repeatedly see the loss of data in environments, and while this was the work of fiction in the 1970s, it's now an actuality across the cybersecurity environments and frameworks. There are a number of different issues that we're seeing, and we're starting to get into an environment where the science fiction is becoming reality almost. Compute is not dealt with readily within science fiction as a major threat. It's always seen as an enabler, or a major area of issue. It's always seen as an enabler. But a recurrent theme in science fiction is what happens to the data. And this kind of picks up in the thematics that Laura has put forward, and also some of the thematics from Jonathan as well. We also have to think about the fact that the world we're in is changing. This is a screenshot from Half-Life Alyx. This was released last year. This is a virtualized environment where effectively as a single player you can go around and interact with effectively a variant of Sophia. The original game designer for Half-Life 2 was Bulgarian, and the architecture is very Eastern European within the game. But the point is that basically the interface is changing and the driving behind that's changing, but the data, where the data is stored behind that interface, is really what we're going to touch on later on. We also have to consider the fact that we are living in a very, very futuristic environment where we have Chappie on the right-hand side here. What we do also have is Boston Dynamics now delivering effectively autonomous devices to your home. They aren't IoT devices. The robots that can move about, interact within the environment in a way that the robot cleaner, the Roomba, can't. So we are living in a huge period of change, but we need to think about what happens to the data that's generated with these devices. Many are connected to the internet, many are going back to cloud services, and what happens within those environments as well. So we are in a period of huge bow wave of technology change, and because we're living through it, we don't really think about it this way. But if you take it back to 1975 and Rollerball and all those types of what the future is going to be like, we didn't expect to have autonomous robots at this level in the home. It was predicted that it may happen 20-something, but we're now in a position where basically we have a very advanced technical environment around us that's only going to extend and expand, and the data footprint from that will also extend and expand. But drawing it back, we also have to think in 2020, Among Us during lockdown became, well, in my house anyway, became a rather popular game. And the premise of this is very straightforward. There are some good guys in a spaceship, and there's a bad guy or some bad guys in a spaceship. And if you're the good guys, you've got to work out who the bad guys are. And if you're the bad guys, you've got to get rid of the good guys. Now, unfortunately, that is a fairly accurate representation of where we are in the digital landscape. Our underlying trends across the current environment is that we're looking at a step change in the scale of cybercrime, which is going to be at 6 trillion by the end of this year. The figures that are shown here on the left are from 2019, and they're probably relatively accurate due to some of the economic stalling that we saw with the pandemic and COVID, the wider COVID lockdowns. But the economy of Japan is seen in 2019 at $5 trillion. The economic impact of cybercrime is now at 6 trillion, which is comparable, maybe higher than the economy of Japan. So if cybercrime, that includes costs and remediation. We see in the press recently people paying ransomware, what's the word I'm looking for? Ransoms is the right phrase, to unlock systems, generally national critical systems. We've seen this with the Colonial Pipeline environment. We're looking at an economy now that if it was standalone is bigger than Japan's. By the end of this decade, it could be bigger than the two that are above it. Now, this causes a number of concerning issues outside of just the immediate analog health pandemic that we're having, is that we're so dependent on technology. This entire conference, how we've all been working for the last 18 months, is dependent around, good functioning, clean IT. So how do we deliver that and make sure that our users are, being looked at and looked after in a way that when they're accessing data or when they're accessing services, how do we make sure that we've got a compliant environment? We also need to consider the current threat landscape. Now, the normal environment for these types of reports, these are World Economic reports, are around these events in the top right hand are the most likely and the most dangerous. So yes, we are in a pandemic, infectious diseases. If we track this back, these were further to the left over the last few years. The climate action failure, obviously climate change is an environment which is becoming more and more mainstream, but also cyber security is becoming more and more mainstream. So we can see that basically, while the cyber security trends in 2017, 2018 year of WannaCry, mass-scale events, had pushed this out to this sector up here on the right hand, they've kind of gone back as security has improved. But the point is that basically security will have to improve again, because given the trends we've just seen for 2021, I would imagine the 2022 report will have cybersecurity further across to the right-hand side and further to the top of this graph. The other area that we need to consider is that the threat causality. Effectively, the purple indicates technological risk. Now, this is across the entirety of how a society is effectively organised. One of the key findings I thought was interesting in this is that the purple lines touch into virtually everything. So we are completely now dependent on IT. It's become a background service. It's like gas. It's like electricity, water. It's something that's there. But drawing out on other thematics that were given earlier, how do we cope and deal with, its ubiquity and its requirement within our society? So one of the big challenges that we all face is the journey to the cloud. During 2019, there was multiple digital transformation programs were accelerated due to COVID-19. Many organizations had to very, very rapidly allow their workforce to access data from anywhere. So there was a push to push multiple data services into public cloud, remote access, all those types of environments were drawn together. But how do we then take a step at this point and say, right, what do we need to actually do here to bring forward the same levels of security as we had on-prem traditionally in a public cloud environment? And the three sort of key areas there are governance, prevention and visibility. And the reason behind that is that effectively our old view of the world was, traditional data center environments, centralized offices, so on and so forth. But now we've got into a cloud-based environment where, there's a hybrid and public cloud, so the sharing of data between our data center and a public cloud environment, remote offices connecting directly to the cloud rather than directly into network SD-WAN style technologies, but also VPN grade technologies, and end users doing that is due to the ongoing pandemic. The change in application structure and function and where data is shared and broken down across a public cloud environment has also moved the software model our users are interacting with further and further away from a more traditional environment, though there are still components that are in the traditional environment. Banking mainframes would be a component that would spring to my mind for that as an example. And the move away from on-premise applications to SaaS-led applications. So the move away from having a Microsoft Office install on your laptop to using Office 365 is a good example of that as well. And the other side is that's sped everything up. So how do we make sure that we can deliver compliance within these environments? And this is a kind of standardized, model where we have our users coming in, roaming users would come in on a VPN either here or into this environment here. We're terminating a VPN concentrator. We then have data sharing between the two environments. And that we have to think about how do we emulate the security mechanisms and compliance standards that we had here when we're out in the public cloud. And Laura brings out some very good points in the last presentation around looking at the public cloud providers that you're using, about what are their standards, etc., for certain regulatory compliances such as Gdpr. So Checkpoint's approach to this has been that basically, and we'll discuss this first, is around having complete visibility. Going back to that idea of you've got to be able to see everything that you can within the public cloud environment. And we do this through our posture management security software. This allows for a tap into the system to basically draw down via an API, draw down the data for what's running across the public cloud instance in AWS, Azure, those types of environments. We then look at basically what the builds are like against policies that are already set in the system. And then from there, basically, we then give the users the ability to alter the build policies of their VMs and databases so that they meet regulatory compliance standards, but also maybe build standards within the organization as well, which maybe weren't met when the service was put out. It's a continuous enforcement environment, so it allows basically for a number of, as devices and services are added to the system, it allows basically the device to be changed and altered in real time to meet the compliance standard. Now, that's a massively powerful tool and hugely useful. So from that side, I think one of the areas is to think here is what we were doing on-prem, we have to emulate in the public cloud to ensure that basically if we're in a regulatory environment, and even if we're not in a regulatory environment, that we're meeting the compliance and build standards that are relevant to our industries, irrespective of what they are. The next areas around this, and this is the thing to think about, is that's that automatic remediation component. Now, one of the areas around this is that effectively the remediation is vital to the build. If you have a service that goes out and you don't know the service is out in the environment, sorry, I do apologise for that, I don't know why those are missing. If the service goes out into the environment, so we build a VM that's non-compliant, you may not notice for weeks, and we'll touch on an example of this later on about what happened and what not to do basically when things don't go to full compliance. So effectively from our posture management viewpoint, it is a case of continuous visibility. It's a case of you can set compliance standards to look at either specific industry regulation or generic build requirements that you have, and you can alter those to meet the requirements across each stream within the organization. Jonathan touched on DevOps, where services have been spun up and spun down. It's I think quite important that in some instances from a DevOps side, and I don't work directly in DevOps, is that the compliance components are met from the build going through to full production, because then everything's built to a standard throughout the entire life cycle of the software. The other sides around this are that effectively account activity intelligence. Now, drawing this back out is that what's going on inside the accounts. These are quite important as well. It's fine that you've got a regulatory baseline and everything's built to a standard, but if you don't have a feedback mechanism and cycle to say something's changed or altered, and also to look at the changes in data flows, etc., and thinking about the GDPR piece about where does data go, if there are changes invoked inside the virtualized instances, it's vital that basically from an organizational viewpoint, you have the ability to either close that down or understand that that's occurred and then track that back and make sure that it's meeting the regulatory environments. The other side is around from the checkpoint side. So that's moving away from VMs and databases, is to look at cloud compliance for firewalls, but this is identical in the checkpoint vernacular to what you would do in an on-prem environment. And checkpoint have the capability of building compliance monitoring for about 300 pre-built standards and regulatory environments across both public cloud and on-prem environments to ensure that basically you're meeting, and there's an example here in the bottom right hand of the slide, but to ensure that you're meeting the practice and requirements that are needed for the wider regulatory environment. So effectively, if we think about that hybridized environment where you have a data center speaking to public cloud, to ensure that basically both sides of the firewalling are meeting the standards as well. So reinforcement again there, and this runs in the background and will alert on a regular basis to state if a device is going out of scope. Now, we do work in a very busy world now, and there's a number of different platforms that we need to look at and a number of different platforms that we need to consider. So having automated services is quite important, but also having services where you can draw down a number of different pre-built, protection profiles, which then can be applied, which meet that compliance, speeds up the entire security journey and story. And it allows for a number of different things in the checkpoint world to be drawn to the customer side to meet that requirement. So hugely powerful set of tools. It's all really about here. It's about the feedback. It's about, we've got a build. Is the build compliant? Yes. Is the build drifting from its compliance? Yes. No. If the answer is no, great. If the answer is yes, here's the remediation cycles that you can take to do it. And you can either automate that with the CPSM platform I've just spoken about, or with the cloud compliance for firewalls. We can also look at automation profiles around that as well. Now, these give us a best practice baseline for regulatory compliance. The regulatory environments change regularly, multi-industry components. So we protect against the base ones, and we have the capability and the adaptability to look at effectively a wider, bespoke requirements through the CPSM platform for VM database builds. But the other area that we need to think about here is, right, so we've got a compliant environment, and this is irrespective of what you're running. You've got a compliant environment, but if you have an issue within the environment, what do you do? And the next part is around really looking at the bigger challenge that we face is where we've built a regulatory compliant environment is the amount of logs that this generates. Now, the figure that is, if all logging's turned on, 2,000 users would generate 10 million logs every day, depending what they're doing within that profile. So from there, a manual search of that's nearly impossible for threat hunting, and a manual search for that isn't going to always draw out a threat actor quickly, and it isn't always going to draw out a threat actor in a manner which will show the entire end-to-end flow chain of what's going on with an attack or an event inside your network. So Checkpoint's approach has been to basically draw together a system to effectively enhance the precision. So effectively auditing the logs that are coming into a centralized service called Infinity SOC to basically from there draw out the key devices that have issues within the environment, look at the activities, network flows, all those things, and preen it down and say, right, we've got 3,000 malicious activities. In this example, there are 40 targeted assets, and they're coming from 11 infected devices. From there, you can drill in, prioritize what needs to be fixed first, and then work through, via the system, the highest probability of actor which is going to cause your organization issues. And there are multiple approaches to this type of solution available, but the point is behind it that basically one of the areas that we need to think about if we're in a compliant and regulatory environment is how do we minimize the impact of that quickly to close down internally a threat inside our network, but also how do we report on it? Because we can do reporting against the regulatory builds, etc., but how do we then generate reports which show us what happened inside the environment? Much of the data loss that we see comes from inside attacks is the attacks take an extended amount of time and they're very low level, and then suddenly they step up, and it's you generally only notice if you're auditing things manually, the step up post the event. Whereas with the checkpoint approach to this, we can then effectively search our threat database, tell you what's going on inside your network, and then from there remediate the actors that are having issues inside the environment, whether it's a laptop, a server, a desktop, but also then from there deliver forensics reporting based on MITRE ATT&CK frameworks to give you a full actionable environment to then reinforce any changes you need to make within the environment prior to the event getting to that peak point. So this is about basically choking off the bad guys before they kill the entire crew, going back to the Among Us analogy at the beginning. The checkpoint approach is effectively around an XDR-style environment where it's full visibility, it's external threat visibility as well, so we can scan both your internal and external to see what's going on, and also to look at the threat intelligence that we have powered through our threat cloud system, the world's largest threat database environment, and to deliver effectively a machine-led learning environment to take out much of the manual components. So we see automation in threat hunting to speed up the process, to improve remediation time, but also that if we think about the automation we talked about with the compliance and regulatory builds within the cloud, if you combine the two of those together, it gives you a far more holistic view of what's going on in the environment rather than drawing down multiple streams from multiple different services to try and then collate it together and assume yourself and then look at that and say, right, well, what's the threat? This will identify very quickly for you what the threats are. Now, the next part is what not to do, and this is one of my favourite examples of what not to do. So in 2019, Ecuador suffered a data breach. Now, Ecuador, we've talked about this before at a couple of Digit events, but if you don't know what happened, Ecuador basically put their tax record out to a data harvesting company, and it's a big file, and the data harvesting company put that out on AWS and didn't secure an S3 bucket, and it was picked up as part of a scan to see who's got open, publicly available S3 environments. Now, as a side note, obviously Ecuador was a safe haven for Julian Assange. Julian Assange's tax coding notices inside the data that's out there. Nothing really bad happened with it other than the fact it was publicly visible on the internet. Nobody took the data and did anything with it. But immediately, and this is what not to do, you need to think about this in terms of regulation, compliance and automation. Immediately, Ecuador decided that they would pass a data privacy law. And there was a huge number of issues that are becoming apparent with the data privacy law that was passed weeks after the event. And one of them is that basically, while they were trying to capture the spirit of we have to make sure that our citizens' data is more secure, was the fact that they didn't really address the component about using third parties for data manipulation and harvesting, even if it's an older environment. They then brought that in subsequently, so it's been a very iterative process for them. So within an environment that's got continuous automated response and detection and build, that would have been picked up very quickly within a cloud environment. The other side is that these types of policies, whether they're written by a government or a commercial organisation, if they're written in haste, generally will miss things. So I do believe prevention's better than cure in some instances. So by having continuous feedback on how the systems they were interoperating with are working, they could probably have picked that up earlier and said, right, well, this needs to be in a fully secured environment. It's not just a case of throwing an entire country's tax record out to a data harvesting company to basically do some clever manipulation that are, stringent rules that should be followed prior to even any of those programs been undertaken. Now, the last thing is, this is what to do, and this comes from a Checkpoint customer. This is from Luke Darby, who is the head of infrastructure and IT at Capital One, so effectively National Radio Broadcast Environment. And Luke and myself were talking about this, and he said I could use this as a kind of his approach to his cloud story and what he's done. Now, Luke uses our CPSM. It was known as Dome 9. It's now obviously our posture management for public cloud and changing name. But he had the thing about basically to watch the development cycle. So to ensure that basically everything is meeting the standards as they're built. They're in quite a strict regulatory environment. So this was a way of effectively delivering a very robust way of checking on what's going on with the build cycle, but also ensuring in the production environment nothing had gone out of scope. As other areas are in the public cloud, turn on all the available security products you have. That's a very sensible approach. Use a centrally controlled login service. Now that's again was his kind of, that was his notes, not mine, but that's his kind of view in this, that everything, no one has their own accounts that get into your production accounts. Everything is centralized. Multifactorial authentication and a group email address to detect configuration abuse, the honesty prompt as he calls it. And again, that's quite, as the organisations in the journey towards full automation and full compliance, that's quite important as well, because people do make mistakes, so it's better it's called out early. Centralize all logs into another account that only tech can access, so he's the head of IT, so he wants oversight about everything that's going on. Centralised billing to avoid credit card nightmares, I thought that was quite pertinent as well. And also learn how billing works, because it will reveal, and this was, to me, was quite interesting, learn about the billing cycles within the cloud environments that you're in, or any of the public service environments you're drawing down SaaS, to work out if somebody's turned something on or bought something else. And from there, that'll then basically draw out what's going on. So I think these are quite a pertinent kind of points that he's making here, and that's Luke Darby's Cloud 101. So with that, I'm on time for once. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, that'd be great.
I would argue about you being on time, but yeah,
I'm not on time. I'm sorry.
I'll grant you that. When we're talking about privacy, when we're talking about all this regulation and things, do you think that punters actually care?
I think we should. Do people care? No, but I think one of the areas is in public. If we think about any service that we access, we expect it to be at standard. So in terms of data protection, those types of things, and we're moving from a very analog to a very digital world rapidly. Many more services have been digitized. So I think this will become more pertinent. I mean, if you were to ask me a year ago, would an OT attack in an oil pipeline in the US be headline news in the UK, I would have said no. But we're now in a position where basically this is now entering the common vernacular. You know, ransomware is now a word that's used readily. So I can see that compliance, etc., these things are quite important. My mother, who's 72, did say something which I still will live by, that somewhere down the line someone will fall foul of a group of old women who are widows, who have got a lot of time and a lot of money to take a class action out against them. And her view on it, she taught computing at school, her view on it is that people will take notice when it impacts them. And I think that's the thing. I think just now a lot of cyber events that we see are against individuals, right? So you get your text scam for, giving out your bank details because there's a thing in the post office. I think where basically that lies is it gets wider, and unfortunately this probably will happen given the laws of probability. An organisation has a data breach. We used Facebook as an example, but earlier in the previous presentation, but an organisation of, say, that scale, if they have a large scale data breach that then impinges people, and it's generally financial impingement, that's where the problem starts to come. And I think at that point, I'm not saying it would be Facebook, it could be anybody. The point is that basically one of these large public access service providers, if you get to that point, that's where people will demand the regulation to be there, as they're expecting it to be. I think people expect the regulation to be there, but the tech's so fast moving, the data flows between services, changes in legislation, it is difficult for some organisations to keep up with everything that's changing. So this is what I've shown is an approach to basically, our approach to cutting through the majority of that. But going back to the last part, that's practical experience with Luke Darby. That's not me speaking on behalf of Checkpoint. The practical experience is that basically you need to stay on top of this as an organisation so that you don't find yourself in those positions. So hopefully that answers that.
It does indeed. It does indeed. Sadly, that's all the time we've got, Mark. But thank you very much for your presentation.
Very welcome. Thank you, Mark.
I like the idea of having a sort of best practice code, but given the fact that this is an international issue, it probably would mean, supposing somebody out with the UK came up with a best practice code that was designed by angels, was absolutely bulletproof and 100%, it may not be politically acceptable at the moment to adopt it. So, there are all these issues to address too. We're going to break for lunch now for 60 minutes. The final session of the day will start at 1:30. Take the time if you can to visit the exhibition hall during the breaks, see the solutions on offer, and please support our sponsors without whom these events could not happen. And don't forget to enter the prize draws as well. I'm Mark Stephen. Thanks again for your attention.